I have for quite a while now wanted to make a video about Armored Core, but until now have mostly failed. I have wanted to say something about this series, something genuine and something interesting, but until now I have struggled with that quite a bit. Now, as a guy who makes videos about mecha, it was both obvious I should talk about this series at some point, but behind that obvious fact lingered a difficult truth. I didn't know what to really say, really down to three big reasons. Argon, just talk about the mechanical design. Talk about the various influences that created Armored Core's mecha. You already have a video doing just that. Well, that's the question that leads to my first big hurdle. Where to start? It's true, I could mention Shoji Kawamori's influences on this series, but I could also just, and should kind of soon, make a video on just Kawamori. Kawamori also didn't design all, or even most, of the general mecha in the series either. So beyond that, where do I even begin? Being asked to describe the mechanical design of Armored Core is kind of like being asked to do an essay on how espionage is presented in James Bond. Which James Bond? Which era? Which period? Or, metaphor aside, for Armored Core, which generation? That's my first issue. There is simply too much to say about these mecha in any one small video. I may still try this at some future point, but I couldn't before now, and even right now, the reason why is my second reason. The second was, I don't like to talk about stuff that I don't have a personal connection or understanding of. For Armored Core, I didn't want to make a video until I took the time to play these games, and until recently, I'd never done just that. Now long ago, in the before times, I had an Xbox 360 demo disc, which had a playable demo of a game series I hadn't heard of at that time, Armored Core 4. In the primordial age, I would rent and play both 4 and 4 Answer. That was the only games I had really known. I remember them still quite fondly, even now, 2,000 years later. So prompted by a friend of mine, it wasn't until I was making my big Gundam video that I actually sat down and got to work playing through this series. Then, it was about most of the way through the second gen when the big news broke. Master Chief was leaving the cryopod. Samurai Jack was getting a finale. King Arthur has returned and has been spotted in England. Armored Core 6 is happening. This pushed me to complete my playthrough of 2nd, and then go on to 3rd and 4th gen after that. However, while I had now played this series, I was confronted with this dreaded reality. Armored Core is a post-apocalyptic, barren wasteland of characters and narrative. Now, as much as that may sound critical, it isn't. I do enjoy these games a lot, but this won't surprise anyone familiar with the series. What I think perfectly sums up what I mean here is something from a little while ago. You see, for years, people, mostly normies and casual anime fans who only watched a certain show, would say this one phrase, "Oh, is special. It's not like those other mecha shows. It's about the characters. Those other mecha things are just about robots." Now this is, categorically, bullshit. Mecha anime, mecha movies, even many mecha games are most certainly about the characters. The villains and the heroes who pilot these titanic metal gods and their immense power, taking them into battle. And I would tell these people just that this impression is mostly one made by people who haven't watched enough mecha or engaged with it to know that. So why do I bring that up? Because what these and most people are thinking of, that kind of mecha story, where it's really just the mecha, it's basically Armored Core. Oh no! Oh, Argonbolt, what? Oh, you hate this series. Oh, this hurts my emotional investment and attachment. Why is this video like half an hour long? Shh. This is my third big tough reason for taking so long to make this video. The very first Armored Core game that had art done of it had its various ravens, the mecha pilots of its world, be displayed, but then it didn't use them. Pretty much every game afterwards did the same. What I would consider a basic visual way of showing characters, talking sprites, floating image boxes in the corners of the screen, even characters in cutscenes. Hell, even, I don't know, Ace Combat 4 style still life storyboard shots. None of it was used or even attempted really. Armored Core as a series is one where pretty much every major character is a sparse voice coming out of a mecha, or the average body of both you and the enemy is a customizable, modular, paintable mecha, or a giant collection of pathetic cannon fodder normals. And those characters, for much of this series, they would have so few lines you could probably write the entire script of an early Armored Core game on like 9.5 post-it notes. In-mission dialogue is sparse if non-existent. Mission briefings are pretty light. Hell, even after mission briefings may not exist, or maybe one small email saying, hey, good job shooting all them big ants that the company made, oh, you got a little scuffed up while you're losing half your pay, loser. These games have specific ravens who show up, have logos and so on, but may have only 1 or 2 lines of dialogue, or may have nothing at all to say to you besides, "Hey, you are a baby man, you won't beat me." Then about halfway through their fight with them, "Wow, so you are a tough baby man after all." Then you defeat them and they go, "Tough baby man, if only we had met under different tough baby circumstances." I think nothing sums this up better than the fact that even a character who does show up and is developed as much as possible as an early Armored Core cares to, Sumika, pilot of AC Coral Star, was still written so basically and flatly, one weird Japanese guy could maybe be inspired to just write her into an actual heroine of his massive weird mecha VN pet project. Really, I would say the tipping point is 3rd Gen's Last Raven, where you have multiple characters playing a part in the plot, and a complex layered time storyline of intrigue and betrayal. This building, ticking time bomb leading up to the main antagonists of Evangel and his big plot to "Damn you, Last Raven, you tough baby man. I wanted to be the toughest dominant baby man. It's up to you now." Oh, god damn it. Okay, fine, so it's really actually with 4th Gen. Specifically for Answer, where it really starts to really catalyze to what I feels like a filled out, satisfying plot. You have 2 very big plot lines, a lot of twists and turns. As a whole, 4th Gen and 4 Answer have a truly world-sized group of competing companies, with Orca and Collard acting as fighting factions at war. Otstarva Thermidor, Windy Fadchin, Neonidas, Roy Saland, Wang Xiaolang. None of these characters are crazy deep or amazingly well written, but it does feel like a full, actual cast. While they are still kind of simple and straightforward, it works, it meshes for me. It's more polished narrative execution of what Last Raven tried. It had a line of AC writing finally stick with my brain. "League dogs, welcome to Earth." You even have the beginning of the demon/dark/elden/blood style lore archaeology aspect as well, where background details can be inferred in 4th Gen based on who shows up to fight which fights. Even the title descriptions of the one-on-one fights tell you an incomplete but more fleshed out background on these mecha pilots and their allegiances. It's still not insanely massive narrative, but it satisfies me. You can put stuff together. Now, having said that, I do want to draw something of an example and a parallel here. To show what I mean, Armored Core 4 and 4 Answer came out in 2006 and 2008 respectively. Now if we say, I don't know, compare them to a totally random other series, also published by Bandai Namco, also with the initials AC, that is Ace Combat, a series with not a small amount of mecha DNA in it, what I am getting at becomes obvious. Because way back in 1999 with Ace Combat 3, Project Aces, the creators of Ace Combat, would add narrative. So much narrative that the English translation team literally gave up. Briefings, news reports, commercials, people sending you video mail, people directly Skyping you, cutscenes, in-mission dialogue, after-mission debriefings. The works. Now it's true, later Ace Combat games toned this down a bit, but they largely kept up this level of narrative presence. It only took them 2 Ace Combat console games to want to try to add an ambitious, huge amount of narrative and then keep that up. It's the reason, despite being a Jet arcade game, lines like,
"I was just a child when the stars fell from the skies.
Go dance with the angels, mister."
live on in my mind. Armored Core, on the other hand, and more importantly FromSoft, the creators, have such a dramatically different approach to narrative. How it should exist in their games, what it should do, and who in the characters it should come from. From AC1 through most of 3rd Gen until really, Last Raven, these games are as narratively vast and barren as the industrial landscapes that fill them. While a lot of Armored Core games didn't have a big narrative to satisfy me, other people, namely Armored Core fans, don't really mind this. But my larger point is, now having played these games, with a big question, what to say about them. If I can't tackle the mechanical design yet, and there isn't really a ton of story, what then to say about Armored Core? If you know you want to say something. This is where I was stuck for quite literally many years as I rolled this video's idea around in my mecha-obsessed brain. Now I did find something big, something interesting to talk about. But to get there, something else needed to happen first. As I already mentioned, Armored Core 6 was happening. A few years ago when I wanted to make this video initially, no one was really, okay, well there was very, very dedicated Japanese fans, almost no one were making videos on Armored Core. Now suddenly, many people were. Which leads me to... With the big news, suddenly lots of people, came out of the woodwork. AC fans who had been waiting for this new game for now about a decade. It was genuinely pretty fascinating to see. Like all the Armored Core fans were just big metallic cicadas that had been living underground, sucking what little AC sap they could out of emulated 4-answer multiplayer. And now they were emerging all over. With this swell of awareness and excitement, I have seen a bunch of new channels focusing on just that, or channels who covered previous FromSoft games now looking at this series, for better or worse. On a sliding scale, I would say Sinclair Lore's videos to be not too bad, though I mostly found out she did a Dominion Tank Police video and that kind of entertained me a lot more. At the same time though, it wasn't all smiles and gumdrops. I did find that while many new people, wanted to talk about Armored Core, the quality of what they were saying varied a lot. So while trying to figure out what to say about Armored Core myself, it was seeing what not to say that helped me figure that out. As a mild example, Brad Wooten made a video a few months ago called The Westernization of Armored Core 6, the music of Rubicon. All in all, there's some stuff in here I would say I agree with, namely that Fires of Rubicon seems to be drawing inspiration from the bigger, spacier synth of Ridley Scott, and later Denis Villeneuve's aesthetic stylings. However, at the same time Brad makes some big mistakes. The kind of mistakes a naive and new fan, or a narrow and inexperienced fan of science fiction, mecha, or mecha science fiction makes. What comes to mind as a perfect example is his starting claim that Armored Core in the past was never directly influenced by Western sci-fi, which is, sorry Brad, categorically bullshit. Now I know what he's trying to say here. He is trying to draw a line in his essay by saying FromSoft's previous games were Japanese mecha SF, and that Fires of Rubicon is a big departure, but it isn't really true. In the very same video he notes AC used genres such as drum and bass, a personal favorite of mine which started in the United Kingdom, not Japan. So musically, no, 6 is not the first acoustically Western work, and no, Armored Core 6 is not some new shift there really. But further, and my main point about, drawing conclusions without sufficient experience or research, that very was never directly influenced line is lingering on an image of what? White Glint. From what game? 4-answer. Who designed White Glint? Shoji Kawamori. From the Ali Barter Forbes interview. There are lots of directors I like, but Yasujiro Ozu is definitely one of my favorites, along with the earlier works of Stanley Kubrick. Now what Kawamori is saying here is probably 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is what I mean by naive. The truth is, despite the separate cultures, Western and Eastern SF nerds are more alike than what seems obvious on the surface. As another perfect example from that game, AC 4-answer features multiple designs by Makoto Kobayashi, who I've done a video on. In an interview with Forbes, Kobayashi mentions, "The reason I got into all this mecha design type work was because of Star Wars. Until then, I was just a boy who liked doing pictures and drawings. It gave me an opportunity to see something many were not able to see within Japanese anime production. That is to say, there were massive amounts of production design pictures or drawings that were made available in books. There are also books published to show the process of how all these drawings were done. That allowed me to see the process, and then I understood it, and it made me feel like I could do it. After that, I tried to create my own backgrounds or mecha designs myself." See? This is what I mean. Even Battletech, the must-stompy Western robots, was in small part inspired by Dougram and anime. There are a million friggin' Dirty Pair references in Star Trek The Next Generation's background props. Japanese and US SF nerds are not as different as they first appeared. So, no, the statement Armored Core was not influenced by Western SF is pretty objectively false. Okay, so that is it then. Now you know what not to... Oh no. Oh god, no. An hour? Oh, fuck off. Can't you just stick to your lore BS and not? Then VatiVidya decided to try to suck onto and be into Armored Core. I don't like VaatiVidya. I don't like his pseudo-intellectual breathy videos, or his bordering on roleplay use of the words cry, despair, suffering, but I know what the elephant in the room is. It's the relationship between Dark Souls and Armored Core. Dark Souls and subsequent games were a huge fucking success. That success was in no small part down to some genuinely challenging game design, and in filling the gaming ecosystem's ecological spot a good 3D Castlevania should have been filling. But Dark Souls' popularity was also attached to something more. What I mentioned earlier, my third reason for struggling to make this video. FromSoft's approach to story. What began in 4th Gen Armored Core was pushed further with Demon's Souls, and then Dark Souls. A fractured archaeological approach to narrative. Do you know who the Jello Man of Fart Lake is? Well, you need to find the Jello Man's hat, fork, harmonica, and maybe even with all that, you only have fragments of who they are. This meant many fans had to do their own work to figure out what was going on. As hostile as the enemies and level design could be, the story was likewise. This opened the way for an avalanche of lore YouTubers, Vaati being the biggest. People who could just explain it to you while you worked on homework or had other things to do. And this is the root of my initial dislike. I never needed a Vaati. Half the fun of Souls games to me was in piecing it all together for myself. For example, I have a pretty solid chronological timeline of when and where each area in Dark Souls 1 was built and in what order, based on nothing but location and architectural style. I did that for fun. I just like thinking about this stuff. Maybe I'll make that into a video at some point. So Vaati and the other lore YouTubers to me always felt redundant. The other thing to note is Vaati's initial success was not out of nowhere. The reason his Dark Souls vids could be made was in no small part thanks to the Dark Souls community doing the initial heavy lifting. This is why his recent Elden Ring videos have been much shakier now that he can't bank on a stockpile of lore exploration and has to do it in real time, thus getting it wrong occasionally. This is also why he credits people now after the blowback. Beyond that though, he falls into being very much a human billboard type. And in general, I hate human billboards. But Argon, what is that? Basically, it's a fan who brands themselves with one big, specific thing. A game series or the like, and then builds their entire career off of it. These people have a hard time dealing with criticisms of their work. Their takes start to bend a lot to fit it. And they don't really seem to have much of a personality beyond their one big thing. It's one of the big reasons why I made sure to make ROM and videos on different stuff. I don't, for example, ever want to just be the human billboard for Gundam, and that's it. But most of those gripes are old gripes. The main thing that annoyed me here is how he just trying to now shift to Armored Core. As it is FromSoft's next release, and he needs to go where the money and views are. It's like, Vaati, hello? Weren't you the priest at that Christian church for like 10 years? Now you want to be the rabbi of this synagogue? Listen, I know they're both Abrahamic, but really? Come on? Like his claim in his AC video, he played it on original hardware as much as possible, despite showing an emulator texture bug 3 minutes in his AC1 footage. Yeah, sure, original hardware, The PS1 was noted to have great issues running PS1 games. But Argon, you just said earlier you played through these games yourself. Didn't you do the same thing here? No, not really. I emulated the fuck out of these games. I will not hide that. About a year or two ago, I got forward for answer for my 360, but otherwise I won't pretend for a second that I'm some kind of original game Armored Core player here. I mapped AC1's directional camera inputs onto the numpad, or as I call it, superior arrow keys. It was fun as hell. I did the same with 3rd Gen's camera controls. Just because FromSoft needed a decade to acknowledge the second analog stick doesn't mean I have to. But this is all kind of to my point. If people want to play these older games, there's no issue of original hardware or not. It's just, does it emulate well or does it not? But the key difference here is that Vaati needs to pretend to be a new authority with his genuine appreciation of these games. He needs to act like he is your main source for Armored Core, but really anything FromSoft does. And you know what the most damning thing for me is? Before this year, before 2023, in all his 10 fucking years of making videos, before now, before when it was popular and thus profitable to make videos on it, did he release a single fucking Armored Core video? The answer, as far as I've found, is no. He just wasn't interested in Armored Core. 10 years. The reality is very simple. Vati isn't an authority, he isn't the lore master of Armored Core, he is, basically, just another schmuck who may have enjoyed some of these games at best, and at worst is a grifter strategically shifting to AC to milk views because it's From's next big thing. While a niche of Armored Core fans, both Western and Japanese, were playing, running little emulator online arena matches, keeping the torch of Armored Core lit in the long, dark years after Armored Core 5, and just hoping and waiting for FromSoft to maybe one day get back to it. For me, those folks are the real heroes here. Really, the only thing worse than no one talking about Armored Core is having to listen to Vati pretend to talk about how great it is. So once again, fuck right off. I don't think he really believes or has great attachment for the heart within the mecha. The core under all the armor. And that was my big sticking point, really. Yeah, I played through all these damn games. Yeah, I could prattle on for each game in a giant 1-hour video giving basic observations. Did you know ravens pilot ACs? While also acting as an in for people who don't feel like they're worth playing. An in for people who want to leech off the excitement of there being a new Armored Core, despite not actually having played a single Armored Core. I know you're out there! I know it would fill the background noise while you are at work, waiting for a class to start, trying to fall asleep with something in the background. But I would much rather try to say something, and try to say something genuine. Something new, something interesting about these games. It would actually do some justice to my personal memory of barely having been able to move and shoot with the speed of Armored Core 4th Gen. When I put that little Xbox 360 demo disc into my machine those 15 long years ago. But then something happened. Recently, I was arguing with a dumb person online. Arguing about another crazy Saudi project. A massive money sink to build, well, a big wall. A great wall. When all I could think about was how an AC wouldn't look out of place flying around it. That led me to a video about these kinds of structures. Wait, beyond that video was a book about just this. Wait, these ideas, these structures, these megastructures, these objects. Oh my god, it was so obvious. It was in front of me the whole time. I found what I needed to say. In 1912, a book called The Nightlands was published, written by William Hope Hodgson. It would take place far into a desolate future. A future where the remnants of humanity all live inside one massive pyramidal city. The pyramid, a timeless shape and structure, and the time beyond the end of the world. In the late 1950s, a famous architect, Buckminster Fuller, a man obsessed with geodesic structures, suggested building a dome over central Manhattan. It would allow the climate to be controlled and air quality to be maintained in the face of worsening pollution. In Saudi Arabia, a country made rich supplying the oil for gasoline, petrochemicals whose prevalence helped to create climate change, began in 2022 a project. Neom, a linear city many kilometers long. A city built with new technology to supposedly reduce human impact. In France, across the time between Buckminster Fuller's dome and the Neom project, many new philosophers would help to create a new theory. Foucault, Camus, Derrida, Baudrillard, a theory of how thought would expand beyond the old structures of power, of nations, governments, races, and religions, a postmodernism, a world beyond the old structure. But they were wrong. In 1979, a landmark moment, Japanese anime would have a turning point of its genre occur, a genre featuring giant humanoid robots. The robots would fight and be piloted around titanic space stations, the orbital homes of humanity. In 1991, the Berlin Wall fell. The West won the Cold War. Neoliberalism and capitalism won. History was declared by some as over. An endless postmodern future seemed to stretch into an infinite horizon. History, of course, in reality, never ended. Then, in Japan, just 6 years later, a group of game developers would create a new series. This series was called Armored Core, and was set entirely within an underground city, where mecha were piloted within tunnels, within factories, within the flesh of a bleak and all-encompassing system. That same year, a different, but also Japanese group of artists would make a game. It would be hugely successful. The first part of its story would take place in a city built on an immense framework. 4 years later, a movie was made, sharing the name of the famous game as well, for being largely unrelated. However, it did feature the survivors of an apocalyptic wasteland Earth, living inside the ruins of New York City, under a massive protective dome. In 2023, the UN warned there was over a 66% chance the planet's temperature will rise 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The cause is climate change. The cause is industrialization. It is machines. It is the structure of our machine world destroying and overpowering the natural. Whether we wanted to or not, there is an inescapable force. A force we made that was now entombing everyone. In 2003, 20 years ago, I opened the pages of a new book. I had gotten it for my birthday. It was a book on robots, real machines, and the machines of fiction. Its jacket was a glossy plastic byproduct. It was a section on robots in games. And within those pages, in the corner of the book, was a series of images, giant machines on the backdrop of a huge city. The page mentioned the survivors of a ruined Earth, living underground. The name of this game was Armored Core. As you will soon see, these things are all linked. These things are all parts attached to a core. To show what that thing is, we must ask a question. Argonbolt, no. No, stop, I feel something. Something in my mind. I just want cool robots. Cool robots you droned on there. How are they? I want epic fight montages. Oh, there will be an epic montage at the end. Your mind hurts because you are feeling it. You are thinking. Go ahead, ask it. It's the title of the video. You know you want to. What are these mega structures? What are these objects? What is the hyper object? Yes, at last we have arrived. The first and best thing to get out of the way is that, contrary to the name, no, hyper objects are not in fact just defined as big buildings. Though massive buildings, and definitely megastructures, are 100% candidates for hyperobjects under this definition. As laid out in Hyperhobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World by Timothy Morton. In the ecological thought, I coined the term hyperobjects to refer to things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. A hyperobject could be a black hole. A hyperobject could be the Lago Agrio oil fields in Ecuador, or the Florida Everglades. A hyperobject could be the biosphere or the solar system. It will become increasingly clear that hyperobjects are not simply mental, or otherwise ideal, constructs, but are real entities whose primordial reality is withdrawn from humans. Hyperobjects give us a platform for thinking about what Harman calls objects in general. Yet I trust that, by the end of the book, the reader will have a reasonable grasp of how one might use this powerful new philosophical approach for finding out real things about real things. But Argonbolt, what does that mean? In practice, what the hell are these things? Well, I'm glad you asked. As a perfect example, 100 years ago now, a dominant hyperobject did not exist. It was born when a US Army truck convoy left Washington, D.C. on July 7, 1919, and then, after a 5.2 thousand kilometer drive and 573 hours of driving, they reached Oakland, California, then taking a ferry to San Francisco. This convoy helped to inspire the game Death Stranding. This convoy had future President Dwight D. Eisenhower as one of its over 300 members. This convoy was arguably the first transcontinental, oil-powered, mechanical seed of what now exists as the US highway network. By 2019, 100 years later, cars, highways, interstates, and in particular, US cars on US highways and interstates, now crisscrossed and hyper-objected their ass as a staple of American civilization, for better or worse. The hyperobject of the US used the hyperobjects of industrialization to give the hyperobjects of cars a concrete circulatory system, in and of itself, a hyperobject. Now think, where have you seen highways? Many examples of highways. No, that's crazy, you're crazy! They're just systems, just things human created. We could tear them all down, we could use our machines to destroy it, we could detonate all the highways. I'm glad you mentioned that. Continuing on from the same book, a hyperobject could be the sum total of all nuclear materials on Earth, or just the plutonium, or the uranium. A hyperobject could be the very long-lasting product of the direct human manufacture, such as styrofoam cups or plastic bags, or the sum of all the whirring machinery of capitalism. Hyperobjects are hyper in relation to some other entity, whether they are directly manufactured by humans or not. So let's begin to think about hyperobjects in some depth. What is the most striking thing about their appearance in the human world? Naturally, humans have been aware of enormous entities, some real, some imagined, for as long as they've existed. But this book is arguing that there is something quite special about the recent discovered entities, such as the climate. These entities caused us to reflect on our very place on Earth and in the cosmos. Perhaps this is the most fundamental issue. Hyperobjects seem to force something on us, something that affects some core ideas of what it means to exist, what Earth is, what society is. Over billions of years, life on Earth evolved. In that process, it used vast amounts of carbon to do so. Plants, in particular, evolved faster than life forms which could properly break down their powerful carbon-using body pieces. The pieces built up, were compressed and crushed. Then, by pure coincidence, the geology in part of the world was less active. There, the liquid carbon, the oil in particular, built up. Many, many millions of years passed. Humans evolved, spreading over the Earth. By sheer coincidence, one of the cradles of civilization began near where the oil was built up. In that place, humans built some of the first farms. The brutal, unforgiving desert made the rich water valleys with their irrigations for food some of the only places humans could eke out a living. There, the humans built some of the first cities. The brutal desert gave rise to religions, ones which would spread over the Earth, until the day when human machines and minds, seeking out a dense source of energy, found the processes by which combustion could be harnessed, and harnessed that sleeping black power under the desert. The global petrochemical economy was created. But by that same brutal desert, combined with the value of oil, combined with the now stubborn religions which held power there, the region, once laughed at as a barren wasteland, turned into a treasure trove for the inhabitants. The descendants of the machines which needed that rich black fluid to live were put to use in wars for those very desert lands. But irony gets the last laugh. For you see, the value of that oil was so ludicrously high, those nations, like Saudi Arabia, suffered from a curse. Dutch disease. Why try to spend money on opening a factory, building or growing or making things in Saudi Arabia, when the same fortune in oil and its profits could be used to simply buy it and import it from elsewhere? The oil is quite literally so sought after, like the dry hot sands of the desert it is pumped out of, it kills or stifles any other form of economic life that tries to take root there. But the oil is finite, and one day, it will cease to exist. The Saudis know this. So, out of desperation, they created plans and projects, like Neom. Along a barren tract of desert, they would use the same fortunes born of that finite oil to attempt to build a new and innovative city. One where perhaps science and technology would do something to help reverse the curse of the oil and its Dutch disease. They will, more than likely, fail. I read about this city while trying to think of a way to say something about Armor Corp. So now, we have come full circle. Argon, I just want to see cool robots. I don't want to know such things. Too bad! As you can clearly see, hyperobjects give birth to new hyperobjects. Hyperobjects can be massive in size, can be ancient in time. They needn't be infinite. They can be natural or man-made, and most importantly, they exist without the consent or approval of humans. They just are. It goes without saying then that there are many, many examples in media, Japanese anime, and of course my beloved Japanese mecha. The Matrix is a hyperobject, its vast mechanical simulation and power plants, the squid robots who fix and maintain it. Now Baudrillard's original concept of the Matrix is verging on the idea of a hyperobject, but Baudrillard, like postmodernism in general here, failed. It failed in that it presumed human subjective experience, combined with an endless ocean of insincere irony, could trump the world, when, as we see from our present modern-day climate crisis, it most certainly does not. Literally, there's a smoke over my city from trees burning. I can't ignore this, by the way, it makes me cough really bad. Insofar as our lived world goes, we have left the postmodern age. We have entered the age, as Timothy Morton suggests, of the hyperobject, and the end of the world. I think a work which perfectly captures this spirit, and a great personal favorite of mine, is Tsutomu Nihei's Blame, a story of a lone character traversing an endless megastructure, a never-ending expanse of brutalist vistas, rooms, halls, and canyons. A vast building built by mechanical builders, long since having lost their original reason and masters who committed them to building eons ago. Like the bacteria which gave the world air to breathe, which you now breathe yourself, the hyperobject of the builders are simply continuing a process. Final Fantasy VII's Shinra Corporation, its Midgar city built on massive suspended plates, the Mako energy of the planet they siphoned to power their civilization, all of these things too are hyperobjects. Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, its Shinto concept of kami, both natural and alien, the barrier cities humans hide within, all these too are hyperobjects. Or my delightful, lovely, beautiful Gundam. The Earth Federation government, the Earth sphere of the moon and the Earth and its gravitational fields. Its colonies, the structures of those colonies themselves. Indeed, Gundam's space colonization, driven by overpopulation as well as climate collapse. As Morton notes, even the massive density of the exponentially increasing human population itself could be seen as a hyperobject, created by leaps in agricultural technology and logistics since the 18th century agricultural revolution. Perhaps, and here is the thought, the whole friggin' idea of the overview effect is merely the shift to perceive the Earth and its climate disaster. In other words, Homo sapiens perceiving the sum totality of the hyperobjects of the Earth and its people, even if it's just a fraction of it, even for just a moment, may actually be what the overview effect is. But Argon, we can change these things! Humans can triumph over the damn hyperobjects, can't they? The relationship is actually not so antagonistic. Hyperobjects exist beyond human scale. They can be made by humans collectively, but also control humans. Humans are like cells within the bodies of these things, natural or man-made. Like a giant organism, their existence determines our lives as tiny things within them. And like cells, we, at least to some of them, the man-made ones, give life and power. Even to the natural ones, we affect them. But also like cells, we don't have the power individually, at human scale, to meaningfully change or affect hyperobjects. Any more than a single skin, nerve, or blood cell can change your clothes or pick up a book. At the point we could say, ruin the hyperobjects of the Earth's biosphere and climate, we would need to manifest another hyperobject like climate change, the burning of fossil fuels, or, I don't know, a giant mass driver on the lunar surface, or a toxic new form of radiation energy to do so? No, oh no, please. I see where you're going with this. Please, just give me the cool montage. I don't want to think anymore. Yes, that's right! Now it is time! What the heck are we looking at? What is this thing? Is this a map? A diagram of some kind of megastructure? No, I know what it's called. It's 3rd Gen's Layered. That is to say, the giant underground home of humanity in primarily AC3 and Silent Line. But is it though? Think about this. Why is it that despite Armored Core repeatedly saying many of these games take place in underground cities, they cheat? AC1 has this open ocean area. AC3 has just a huge variety of weird outdoor areas, jungles and oceans, places where you can see skies, horizons, clouds, and also ancient temples. If I've done my work here, you know what I'm going to say. Layered isn't trying to be, and FromSoft has never tried, to make Armored Core a series about explicitly just underground spaces. Because Layered, like pretty much every space in Armored Core, is a hyperobject. That's it, baby. In FromSoft not wanting to limit their level design, they, with their first game, and then with every subsequent one, never even tried to hide the fact the worlds of Armored Core are nothing more than a delightful, nested bow of hyperobjects. From its very inception, Armored Core's worlds are nothing but hyperobjects. Be it individual machines like AC1's massive air purifier, or AC3's Layered, in its rugged industrial locations, or in the structures of AC4 and For Answer. What is the towering and absurdly immense Exaville when you visit it? What the hell is Line Arc? What is this massive suspended highway thing surrounded by buildings? But Argon, that's impossible! Mr. Morton wrote his damn book in 2013. How could FromSoft be doing that years beforehand? This is crazy! Yes, it is! Because that is what I love about the concept of hyperobjects. They were not created by Mr. Morton. They were not invented. They have existed beyond humans, before the air carrying the vibration of these words made it to your ears. The patterns of the words I'm saying, before either of us were sweaty, upright, bipedal, naked humans. Like the overview effect, it's just a matter of perceiving them for what they are. But AC2 takes place on Mars! Outside, mainly! Yes, a Mars being terraformed. Terraforming is a hyperobject. Morton even agrees. The insideness of hyperobjects is not a physical location. Even if you go to Mars, you have the same problem. In fact, it's magnified since you must create a biosphere from scratch. No! No! AC Nexus and later showed other cities! Hyperobjects can overlap and be stacked. Hyperobject beings, are we? Not merely crude matter. You're getting Yoda, dude! I'm Yodaing you! Well, what about AC4? It's the entire world. Nations no longer exist? Surely. The Pax Economica, the corporation themselves, and the eventual Kojima radiation, as Mr. Morton so nicely puts it. At the Trinity test site in New Mexico, weird light green glass, trinitite, was formed when the nuclear explosion fused sand to 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun. Robert Oppenheimer named it Trinity, after one of John Donne's holy sonnets, Better my heart, three-personed God. Oppenheimer thought of Shiva after the explosion. I have become death, the shatterer of worlds. Oppenheimer had not become death. That role goes fair and square to the hyperobject. The hyperobject of uranium, of fissile matter, was, like the oil I mentioned earlier, not something Oppenheimer created. There is in fact naturally occurring slow nuclear reactors that form geologically. While it took huge human effort to weaponize it, took the hyperobject of the US nation, US military, to drop it on Japan, itself merely, yes you can guess, another hyperobject, contaminating it. None of this was truly created by just a single man. It was the same nation of Japan whose creators would later make Armored Core, specifically 4th Gen, and in particular to my point here, 4 Answer. Because nothing so wondrously acts as a beautiful representation of Timothy Morton's ideas than the cradles. After the war of Armored Core 4 contaminated its world with Kojima radiation, humans who could afford it fled the surface of the Earth. The 2 largest corporations building massive flying cities, the Cradles, powered by Microwave Energy Network, itself powered by Kojima reactors continuing to contaminate the surface, while the poor were left behind to remain and suffer there. As Morton says, the ethical and political choices become much clearer and less divisive if we begin to think of pollution and global warming and radiation as effects of hyperobjects, rather than as flows or processes that can be managed. These flows are often, eventually, shunted into some less powerful group's backyard. The Native American tribe must deal with the radioactive waste. The Nigerian village must deal with the oil slick. Rob Nixon calls this the slow violence of ecological oppression. The arrogant notion of the postmodernists that we had transcended the systems of this world, its hyperobjects, and could be entombed within a subjective capitalist simulation with no major shakeups, is false. The climate crisis is upon us. Humanity is not in fact immune. The hyperobjects were here before us and will exist even after, if we perish from ignoring their existence. It dominates our modern world. Like the Cradles in 4 Answer, it doesn't matter if those who live in them tries to hide. The reality of Kojima radiation poisoning the world of this game, the Kojima reaction and its hyperobject dominate as well. Hopefully, now you see. Considering how little characters or plot happens in the Armored Core games, even considering the games with both substantial plot and characters, the occurrence of constantly the same ideas coming up across dozens of titles leave only really one conclusion. Subconsciously, FromSoft has, for almost 30 years, actually been making games, that is Armored Core games, objectively, primarily, about hyperobjects. Armored Core is a series about the constant repeating series of elements which return over and over. A world devastated by industrialization. A world controlled and monitored by an uneasy alliance of dominant corporations. A world where, as rarely in 2nd Gen's case, those same corporations manufacture a biosphere, or, as in the rest of the series, have essentially destroyed it during their climb to power. As Morton says in the section on The End of the World, it is no wonder that industrial capitalism has turned Earth into a dangerous desert. It doesn't really care what happens through the factory door, just as long as it generates more capital. Do we want to sustain a world based on a philosophy of grey goo? Nature is the featureless remainder at either end of the process of production. Either it's exploitable stuff or value-added stuff. Rather than only evaporating everything into the sublime ether, as Marx said via Macbeth, all that is solid melts into air. Capitalism also requires and keeps firm, long-term inertial structures, such as families, as Fern and Brodel explored. The Koch brothers, or General Electric, are 2 contemporary examples. One part of capital, itself a hyperobject, is the relentless revolutionizing of modern production, but the other is part of a tremendous inertia. What better a sublime example than the corporations of Armored Core? Having so consistently destroyed the world we fight in, yet they endure. Murakuma Millennium, or Zeo Matrix in AC1, Mirage, Crest, and Kisaragi in 3rd Gen, or 4th Gen's Corpse, who dismantled the very concept of nations to make way for their dominance. Algebra, Interior Union, General Armaments. And as if that all isn't already great enough, 4th Gen's arms forts, literally titanic machines, are in a way the physical manifestations of a defense system for the Pax Economica. The arms forts are like the smallest fragment of the corporate hyperobject. Even the teensiest morsel of it is so massive it becomes a walking steel fortress, or a giant flying metal sculpture, or a mobile mountain range of insane proportions. After all, even the tiniest chunk of the moon falling to Earth would mean a hunk of rock the size of New York City. But an even better example lies earlier, in AC3's pulverizers. They are closer in nature to a hyperobject, in their mass-produced otherness to the corporations of AC3 and how they evoke it. As Morton says, what is bestand? Bestand is stockpiling. Row upon row of big box houses waiting to be inhabited, terabyte after terabyte of memory waiting to be filled. Stockpiling is the art of zeugma, the yoking of things you hear in phrases such as wave upon wave or bumper to bumper. Stockpiling is the dominant mode of social existence. Giant parking lots of empty cars, huge tables in restaurants across from which you can't hold hands, vast empty lawns. Look at the manufactured landscapes, the ocean of telephone dials as far as the eye can see, somewhere in China. Or consider the gigantic billowing waves of plastic cups, created by Tara Donovan in Untitled, plastic cups. In massive piles, the cups reveal properties hidden from the view of a person who uses a single cup at a time. Even in the normals, the mass-produced cannon fodder enemies we cut through in Armored Core are generally, endlessly pumped out. Churned out of factories as we the player churn them into bits with our machine guns, missiles, lasers, pile bunkers, and so on. We quite literally fight in Armored Core all the way from the mines where the resources to make them are extracted, to the factories where normals are built on assembly lines, to the streets where they patrol, to the protests the workers attempt with them, all the way to Armored Core 5's intro showing their testing. But now, having mentioned them, I think you might be catching on to something I've been talking around and avoiding. What then does that make the player? What, in this landscape of hyperobjects, of underground cities, corporate wars, and so on, exactly is an Armored Core? So in relation to all of this, what are the mecha of Armored Core? Oh, Argon, you've already said it a million times. I'm just waiting for the cool montage. They're hyper... No. Actually, they're not. What? Yeah, actually, they don't fit the bill. While mecha are big, they're not quite big enough. One of the defining aspects of hyperobjects is they are simply too massive to be perceptibly felt by a single human. You can feel a hot wind on a summer day, but you can't really feel all of global warming. Even astronauts experiencing the overview effect are only perceiving a fraction of the inhuman scale of the Earth and the systems within it. They can't actually mentally perceive the whole Earth in one-to-one detail. They can see Paris, Europe, or the Sahara Desert from space, but they can't also be standing in Paris and the Sahara all at the same time. Like the old story goes of the king who wants the most accurate map of his kingdom, who keeps increasing the detail until his map is the same size as his kingdom. There simply isn't a way to keep things one-to-one in both scale and detail. So Armored Cores, beyond being human-shaped, just aren't big enough. Their human form and the fact that we can rotate them in our garage after customizing them mean it's very easy to hold them in the mind's eye. What about the scale of time then? A hyperobject is also a hyperobject because it can be ancient. The pyramids, while yes, pretty big in size, have become a good example of a not-so-huge object in size becoming a hyperobject of sorts by dint of them existing for thousands of years. Unfortunately, here as well, the Armored Cores are simply not old enough. Their existence is tied to that of their pilots, both their physical forms being customized, but in so directly carrying over a prime rule of mecha. When the machine dies, so does the pilot. The humans inside the Armored Core is its soul. When we destroy the AC, we kill the human. Thus also in time, ACs are simply not big enough to be hyperobjects either. ACs as a concept may as a whole be hyperobject-D, but individually are not. But then, what the hell are they? What are mecha? I think given the philosophical framework I've laid out, and given my previous statements that Armored Core is really the story of hyperobjects, I have only one answer. When mecha began, they began with the power of modernist thought. Mazinger, Gundam, Getter-Robo, all born of the wondrous scale of new technology. Super Chigokin, Lunar Titanium, the Minovsky fusion drive, the Getter reactor. In time though, postmodernism would have its effects on mecha as well. In the conspiracies of Oshi's Patlover, in the psychoanalysis of Evangelion, in the mysteries of the Big O. If we are now living in the time of hyperobjects, and the Armored Core as a series is the story of hyperobjects first and foremost, then the simple answer is this. Armored Cores are the bridge between man and the world of hyperobjects. They are the new body of man attempting to grow and harden to inhabit this world. As technology expanded, our imagination expanded. As humans perceive the scale of space of the world, the human, which remained the same size, our roughly tens of centimeters tall body, our roughly less than a century of life, were left behind in both space and time by the universe and its hyperobjects. Thus mecha, in this way, is a fulfillment of the deep insecurity and yearning, to continue to expand, to fill out a size where we may be somewhat able to match that. Do you still think I'm just philosophizing? What happens in Armored Core itself? Once again, it is the perfect example. These tunnels, these roads, these mine shafts, these factories. If you were a human, these spaces would be massive. But to our AC body, they are just a series of normal rooms. For the entire Armored Core series, with the sole partial exception of 5, most likely in 6 as well, we never are separated from our body of the machine. We see a human pilot rarely in sparse intro cutscenes or as very infrequent enemies. Our main physical body we move, shoot, boost, and fight with is the Armored Core. Mecha is humans attempting to expand to be proportional to this world of hyperobjects. The world is industrial and mechanical, so the body is metal, boosters, machine guns, cameras, radars. The spaces are huge, so the new body is huge. And, as if all of that wasn't good enough, Human Plus. Human Plus I have left for last here because it so excellently proves my point even further. Really, if anybody was doubting it, this is the sticker. When you fail too much early on in AC, or are so inclined later on, the corporations surgically alter your pilot, removing the limiters. Mechanically, the system is kind of whack in terms of gameplay, but philosophically, it's another perfect example. The hyper-objects of the corporation and the world are reaching down and scooping out the limits of the mortal human, enabling them to better move and act with the abilities befitting the scale of this world and its hardships. In a way, Human Plus, to be beyond human, Hyper-object, to be an object hyper, beyond the small scale. Like the word megastructure, structure beyond small, Hyper-object and Human Plus all essentially mean the same thing. So now you see what I wanted you to see. Now you've heard what I felt was worth saying about Armored Core. Why it took me so long to say this. But Argon, if that's true, if the Armored Core is the bridge to the world of hyperobjects, does that mean humans can triumph in this new age? If we expand like this? Now that's a good question. If it were another mecha work, I would say maybe, perhaps, yes. The heroic stories of mecha would certainly agree. The Getter-Robos, the Gunbusters, even at times definitely the Gundams. But Armored Core is not like any of those series. There isn't another series really exactly like Armored Core, now is there? Insofar as the series has shown, the player's pilot, the Raven, or Last Raven, or Lynx, can fight, can win, can change events, defeat all the other AC pilots. But FromSoft's writing shows us time and time again, this doesn't really manifest as a revolution of the status quo in the face of these hyper-objects. Humans finding another city in AC1, or spreading to Mars in AC2, destroying the controller AI of Layered and 3rd Gen, going beyond the Silent Line, not even defeating the Pulverizers, nor the Lynx War, nor the closest AC has come to something truly heroic like For Answer, in its close plan, do this. The more you find out, the more you see. Orca was a plot by the corporations who lost out to the cradles of GA and Interior Union, so to shake up the status quo, they came up with the close plan and funded Orca to do so. The destruction of the orbital sats and expanding to space, even there, the hyper-objects dominate. In the old Greek stories, those with the human-sized gods, the heroes, even when legendary and superhuman, could not outdo or surpass the gods. Hyper-objects are not gods. they are not humanized, and they don't need humans to exist and affect us. But what does hold true is that, like the Greek heroes, our pilot, our armored core, cannot go beyond. They remain within the zone, the space and time of the hyper-object. Oh god, Argonbolt. What do we do? How do we deal with this? The climate change, the pollution in this hyper-object world. I feel numb. I feel trapped. I feel tired. Oh god, what's the... Shut up! Armored Core Cool Montage video time, go!